Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be recapping Day 8 of the Stanley Cup Playoffs Round 1. And finally, a series has concluded, but we'll get to that a bit later. The first game of the day was Canadiens versus Flyers, and this game was basically a carbon copy of what happened in Game 3, as it was the Flyers once again shutting out the Canadiens, this time by a score of 2-0, starting off with a Raffl goal, then following it up with a Philip Myers goal, and that would be the only scoring we would get, and as such, the Canadiens have not scored a goal since halfway through the third period of Game 2, over 2 full games ago. So not a great look for them, and honestly, the good news and bad news for both teams basically remain the same. For the Flyers, the good news is still that the defense is holding up extremely strong. Carter Hart is looking very good, and yet the bad news is that the power play is still completely lifeless for the Flyers, and some of those top players for the Flyers, like Giroux, like Couturier, not really contributing all that much on the scoreboard. The Flyers are lucky that they have some fantastic depth that is really helping them out here in this series, but otherwise, those top players are going to need to step up soon, and of course the fact that they still are having troubles beating Carey Price consistently. On the Canadian side, it is of course very, very similar things. The good news for them, Carey Price still looking very good, although he probably would have wanted to have this second goal back. In fact, if Carey Price was really good, he probably would have just lost this game again 1-0 to the Flyers, but it ended up being 2-0 because of this rough goal that he did let in. Otherwise, bad side, Canadiens still, whatever reason, they can't seem to score goals outside of that game too. And it's a funny stat in this one is the fact that the Canadiens have actually outscored the Flyers throughout this series 6-5, and yet the Flyers are up 3-1 in the series, which really shows that the Canadiens really sort of just pushed in the one game, and the other 3 games there's just been basically nothing for them. And so right now the Canadiens are trailing in this series, and I'm honestly unsure whether or not they're done or if they could actually come back, just because that game 2 is such a wild card here. If, seeing games 1, 3, and 4, I'd say, well, the Canadiens are going to get swept, but seeing that game 2, I'm thinking they could come back in this series. So honestly, not sure what to think of this series. The only thing that I can really say is that it hasn't really been the most exciting one considering these past couple of games. Definitely has nothing compared to this next one, which is the Stars and Flames. This was Game 5. The series was tied at 2, and it would be the Stars to get the advantage here and go up 3-2. It starts off with a Benn shorthanded goal. It would eventually be tied up by Backlund, but then early in the third period, Klingberg would get the 1-goal lead for the Stars, and that would be all they would need to finish off this game and win it and put the Flames on the brink of elimination. Good news for the Dallas Stars. They're showing that they can win in multiple ways, that the previous couple of games, Games 2 and Games 4, the Stars were just outscoring a lot of their problems there, just really pushing it heavily offensively. Even in Game 3 when they got shut out, it felt like they could have had multiple goals in that one. And yet here tonight, the offense maybe not as active as it has been, but what really stepped up, some solid defense and also some good goaltending from Anton Khudobin, as Ben Bishop apparently unfit to play at the moment. We're not really sure what that means, considering the regulations of the NHL that you have to describe it as unfit to play, so I don't know how serious the injury is, but it looks like Khudobin will be the starter for the Stars, at least for the foreseeable future, and it looks to be going pretty well for them in that area. The main bad news for the Stars is that they have been the better team for basically every game here except Game 1, you could say, and yet so many of these scores have been quite close, and they've even lost a game. Game 2, as I said, 1-goal game there. They had to score a goal in the last 40 seconds. Game 4, it was an overtime victory that they only ended up tying up in the last 12 seconds of the game. And here tonight, it was only a 2-1 victory. As such, the Stars have been playing well, but they're really letting the Flames hang around here. And if the Flames can maybe put things together, the Stars could be in a bit of a pickle. On the Flames side, the good news, it basically has to only be Cam Talbot. I was actually watching this feed, and one of the analysts who were, describing the game had said, Michael Backlund for the Flames has been the best Flames player. And then someone chimes in and says he disagrees, that it has to have been Cam Talbot, and I'll agree with that one. Cam Talbot has been very, very good for the Flames. Really, the only reason, I can't even say that because now they're trailing 3-2 in this series, but a big, big reason why the Flames have even been remotely competitive, at least on the scoreboard in this series. if we're being honest, it looks as though at times Talbot is the only Flames player who is actually trying, because that brings us to the bad news. I don't know if this, like, Matthew Tkachuk was some sort of key to how the Flames ran, but they've just looked kind of lifeless. It feels as though they're not really playing as though this is actually the playoffs for them. I don't know, maybe this team feeds heavily off the fan energy in the building, because right now the team is looking like it's the 50th game of the regular season. They don't particularly care about the outcome. I mean, let's take a look at these Flames top players. I guess this isn't necessarily an unusual thing for them, as for whatever reason, whenever it comes to the playoffs, these players sort of pull a disappearing act. While Goodrow and Monahan have been solid on the power play, when it comes at even strength, they've just been basically invisible throughout the 5 games of this series. It's been quite disappointing to watch from a Flames fan perspective, I'm sure. And so right now, I pointed out that the Flames, they've kept the score close, thanks hugely in part to Cam Talbot, but unless they can play significantly better than what they have been doing in these past few games, I think they might just be a bit too down and out at this point. Kind of disappointing with how it's gone for the Flames here. They really should be better, and yet for whatever reason, things are just not really clicking on that side. The next series was Islanders Capitals, and this was one that had the potential to end in a sweep for the Islanders. It would have been the first and only sweep of round 1, and yet the Capitals managed to stave off elimination, at least for now, with the victory. And I was really expecting the Capitals to come out pushing hard in the first period of this game to try and get themselves a lead, but that didn't actually happen. It was the Islanders who came out pushing hard in the first period. They'd get goals from Pajot and Barzal, and by the end of the first, it was 2-0 Islanders, and I was thinking, what has happened to this Washington Capitals team? And yet, at the start of the second, it really started to turn around. They got a goal from Kuznetsov. They then got a goal quickly after from Ovechkin to tie it up at 2. And eventually Ovechkin would add another to make it 3-2. And the Capitals would actually hold on to said lead, and they'd win the game. So the good news for the Capitals, I guess, when the chips, the cards are down here for them, it took all the way until the second period of Game 4, down 3-0 in a series, but a lot of these players really did step up. Kuznetsov and especially Ovechkin were fantastic in this game from the second period onwards, and we finally saw this Capitals team that actually at least begins to resemble the team that won the Cup 2 years ago. The Islanders, certainly a step behind when it came to in the second and third period, and so that's great news for the Capitals. But you have to look at the bad news being this first period. The fact that they could even show up in this game and look that sort of not great in a first period of this big elimination game down 3-0 in the series is actually just insanely suspect here for the Capitals. I mean, after they went down 2-0, their coach had to call a timeout, and it took until the end of the first period going into the second for something to actually click here for the Capitals. So it's not a great look. And of course, the fact that they were down 3-0 in this series, now they're down 3-1. There's only been 4 teams in NHL history who have come back from down 3-0. Can the Capitals be that 5th team? Maybe, but it is of course a long shot. On the Islanders side, the good news is obviously the fact that they were up 3-0. They're still up 3-1. They're still in a perfectly fine position. They came out firing in that first period. They got the 2-0 lead against a team that should have been desperate, so it's great things for the Islanders. But the bad news, it's hard to necessarily call it so much bad news. I mean, how much are you really going to read into the fact that they were outplayed in the second and third period? Do we think that that's something that's going to be able to consistently happen? I'm not entirely sure. I guess the bad news would be is that they got into a bit of penalty trouble. This is really where the game sort of turned on its head. Was this penalty trouble early on in the second period? Honestly, through the first 3 games, the only time the Capitals at least looked remotely competent was when they were on the power play. And so the fact that the Islanders ended up taking so many of these penalties early in the second period, which eventually would lead to the Ovechkin goal being on the power play and the Kuznetsov one being sort of in the middle of this not 5-on-5 play, is not great for the Islanders. If they want to close out this game in 5, they have to play like they did in the first period, not let the Capitals, hang around, and stay out of the penalty box are probably the 3 keys there for the Islanders. And I suspect because this is a Barry Trotz team, I pointed this out after they lost Game 3 against the Flyers back in the plans, because this is a Barry Trotz team, I expect them to correct their mistakes, and so the Capitals are going to have to be just as good as they had been to take out this team, because the Islanders are not a team that's going to mentally crack, in my opinion. And finally, the last game of the day and the series that did indeed finish tonight, it was Golden Knights versus Blackhawks. And this game started off quite well for the Blackhawks. They managed to get this first goal. The second goal, Taves and DeBrincat, they were up 2-0. And we were late in the first period. I was thinking, the Blackhawks could win this game. And considering these past few games have been quite close, maybe there's some sort of chance something happens in this series. But really, I felt like the momentum killer for the Blackhawks was this Pacioretty goal. It came in the dying minutes of the first period, and it made it 2-1. And then that really changed my mindset to be no longer the Blackhawks could actually do something, but that it looks like the Golden Knights might come back. And that's exactly what ended up happening. Stone tied it up at 2. Kane got the lead back for the Blackhawks, at least for a bit, before Martinez would tie it up at 3, and then eventually Tuck would get the 4-3 lead, the first lead for the Golden Knights in that game, and they would close it out as such. Good news for the Golden Knights, of course, the fact that they were the first team to qualify, which is always a nice thing to see. They have played exceptionally well offensively. Their defense has been pretty good. Their goaltending has had a few weak goals, but has generally been quite strong. The main bad news I have to say for the Golden Knights, let's compare them to the Avalanche Coyotes series. I thought that the Avalanche and the Golden Knights would dominate both of their first round series, and for the Avalanche side, it's been mostly the case. Game 2 was somewhat shaky, though they still won, but in games 1, 3, and 4, it's been mostly the Avalanche just completely in control, even if they did lose that game 3. And so that's exactly what I was expecting from the Golden Knights here. But besides game 1, which was obviously entirely controlled by the Golden Knights, games 2, 3, 4, and now 5 have been a lot closer than I thought they would be. Now, that's maybe because I didn't give the Blackhawks enough credit for what they actually are. But it is still worrisome that the Golden Knights had given this much of a chance here to the Blackhawks. And it begins to plant sort of a seed of doubt in my mind about maybe I was overhyping this Golden Knights team. It's very possible that as we move on to round 2, this Golden Knights team just completely rebounds and shows why I felt like they were the best Western Conference team. But that seed of doubt is still there. The fact that this series was actually quite close through these past 4 games does make me wonder what exactly is going on here. On the Chicago side, the future is still quite bright for this team. They still have, a couple of older players, certainly like Keith, Crawford. Kane and Taves are on the wrong side of 30, but they're not super old. They've still got a few years left in them, I would say. And then, of course, they've got some really young players. This was the youngest team in the round 1 remaining. Players like DeBrincat, 3rd overall pick from last year. Kirby Dach is there. Dylan Strome is still there. Dominique Kubalik was a rookie who was fantastic this season. So a lot of bright spots for the Chicago Blackhawks. Would they have rathered have the early lottery pick and not beaten the Edmonton Oilers and Plains? Maybe, maybe not, but it was still some decent experience for some of these younger players who really haven't experienced much playoff action with the Blackhawks, considering the last time they made the playoffs was back in 2017. It was quite the different look back then for the Blackhawks. So obviously Kane and Taves don't really need that playoff experience, but those younger players absolutely do. So a solid run for the Blackhawks. They definitely got a lot farther than I, myself, and many others thought they would. So future's looking good for Chicago. On to my predictions. I had said the Flyers would win in 5 games. They're now up 3-1. It's actually looking like a very real possibility this does happen compared to after game 2 where I thought it was basically not going to happen. I can see the Canadiens coming back in this series as I've said, but 5 games is on the table. In terms of the Stars Flames, I had the Stars in 7. It's looking a bit more like the Stars might take it in 6, but if we could see some life out of the Flames, 7 games still on the table as well. I had said the Capitals would win in 7, technically still alive, and judging by how they played in the second and third period, it's, minutely possible that the Capitals come back in this series, though still quite unlikely. And in the final one, I had said the Golden Knights would win in the sweep 4-0 that ended up taking an extra game, 5 games, so I got the team right, just the amount of games incorrect. Class dismissed.